You hear it in history class. Alexander Nevsky crushes the Swedes. A young prince saves Russia. But nobody tells you the numbers they were working with. July 15th, 1240, where the Izhora dumps into the Neva, 19 miles east of modern St. Petersburg. A Novgorodian watch commander named Pelgasi spots sails, Swedish ships, Norwegian banners, Finnish tribal warriors, all of them hauling Catholic bishops and crusade indulgences signed by Pope Gregory IX. Pelgasi sends a rider. Word reaches Prince Alexander Yaroslavich in Novgorod. He is 19 years old. He does not wait. Here is what you need to understand. The year 1240 is when Kiev burns. Batu Khan's Mongol army storms the capital on December 6th, after a 9-day siege that leaves 50,000 people as 2,000 survivors, and only 6 buildings standing out of 40 major structures. The entire southern Rus collapse. Refugee columns choke the northern forests. The Principality of Galicia-Volhynia submits. Novgorod watches from the northwest and knows they are alone. No help is coming from the south. That is why Sweden moves. They calculate the Russians are broken. Mongols control everything below the Volkhov. This is the moment to cut Novgorod off from the Baltic, seize Lake Ladoga, strangle the fur trade, and force Orthodox Christians to submit to Rome. If you value documented military history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Novgorod First Chronicle, the oldest surviving Russian source on the battle, dated to the 14th century and preserved in multiple manuscript copies, including the Synod Scroll, with sections paleographically dated to the second half of the 13th century. And the life of Alexander Nevsky, compiled in the 1280s by monks who were alive during his reign. We also reference modern archaeological work from St. Petersburg State University historian Petr Sorokin, who in the early 2000s found a 13th century arrowhead near the Alexander Nevsky Church at Izhora, the only physical artifact from the battle site ever scientifically documented. Now back to the information. The Swedish expedition starts in Stockholm. The force crosses the Baltic, stops in Turku on the Finnish coast, then sails east through the Gulf of Finland into the Neva estuary. The Novgorod First Chronicle names the contingent: Swedes, Norwegians, Merman people, some Finns, Yemtavastians. The Chronicle says they come with their prince and with bishops, plural. This is a crusade. Pope Gregory IX sent a letter to the Archbishop of Uppsala in 1237 calling for a crusade against the apostate Tavastians in central Finland who had rebelled against the church. Swedish historians, including Dick Harrison from Lund University, writing in 2005, traced the Neva campaign back to that papal authorization. The Tavastian uprising happened in 1236 and 1237. The Pope urged the Archbishop to send in armed forces. Some historians place a Swedish crusade into Tavastia in 1238 or 1239. The Neva expedition in 1240 follows that momentum. The Swedes are riding crusade energy. They have bishops. They have papal backing. They think God is on their side. Who leads them? The Novgorod First Chronicle names a leader called Spiridon who dies in the battle. Later Russian sources from the 16th century expand the details, but medieval Swedish records are silent. Sweden has no mention of this battle in any contemporary chronicle. That silence matters. From 1222, when King Johan Sverkersson dies, until 1248, when Birger Jarl consolidates power, Sweden is locked in civil war. The Folkung faction fights the crown. Upland nobles resist taxation and centralization. Norway and Sweden nearly go to war after the Varmland expedition in 1225. The country is fractured. Some historians suggest the Neva campaign was not a royal Swedish operation, but a Folkung adventure, nobles from Upland acting independently, grabbing Norwegian volunteers and Finnish auxiliaries, trying to reclaim Viking Age glory without waiting for a weak king to approve. That explains why Swedish royal records ignore it. Defeated freelance expeditions do not make it into the official chronicles. What matters is the number. Modern historians who study medieval warfare estimate the Swedish force at a few hundred fighters. The Novgorod First Chronicle says Swedes came with a great army and very many ships. That is chronicle language. It does not give ship counts or troop numbers. One scholar calculated that if each ship carried 20 to 40 men and the expedition had 10 to 15 vessels, you arrive at 200 to 600 troops. Another estimate from Pravda, published July 15 or 2025, cites 5,000 Swedish fighters. That number appears in some later Russian texts, but lacks primary source backing. The most conservative reading of the evidence suggests several hundred Swedes, Norwegians, and Finns landed at the Izhora mouth. They set up camp, they pitch tents, they unload supplies, they plan to fortify. The life of Alexander says they intended to take Ladoga, then Novgorod, then all Novgorod lands. Whether that was realistic or not, that was the stated goal. Pelgasy, the Izhorian elder who commanded the Novgorodian watchpost, was a Christian according to the life. His observation post sat at the confluence of the Izhora and the Neva. Some historians place it near where the Fontanka River joins the Neva in modern St. Petersburg, but the battle site is confirmed at Izhora, 19 kilometers downstream from the Alexander Nevsky monastery that Peter the Great mistakenly built in 1710, thinking it marked the battle location. Pelgasy sees the Swedish fleet. He sends word. The message reaches Prince Alexander in Novgorod, 70 kilometers southeast. Alexander Yaroslavich is the grandson of Vsevolod the Big Nest, Prince of Vladimir. Between 1228 and 1233, Alexander and his older brother Fyodor ruled Novgorod in the name of their father Yaroslav. Fyodor dies in 1233. Alexander takes full control. He expands Novgorod power into Finnish lands. He strengthens the boyar class. He is building a military machine. When the Swedish sails appear, he does not hesitate. The Novgorod First Chronicle says Prince Alexander did not hesitate at all, but went against them with Novgorodians and people of Ladoga. He moves fast. He does not wait for reinforcements from his father Yaroslav, who is Prince of Pereyaslav-Zaleski. He does not wait for troops from outlying Novgorod territories. He assembles his druzhina, his personal military retinue. He calls for Novgorod volunteers. He picks up additional fighters from Ladoga as he moves north. According to the chronicles, his force numbers around 1,300 soldiers. That number comes from later sources. The earliest chronicle does not specify. Historians who study medieval Russian armies note that a princely druzhina typically ranged from 300 to 500 professional warriors. Add Novgorod militia horsemen and footmen and Ladoga volunteers, and you can reach 1,000 to 1,500. One estimate published in Pravda breaks it down as 300 princely warriors, 500 horsemen, 500 foot militia. The exact count is debated, but the consensus lands between 1,000 and 1,500 fighters under Alexander. That is not 10,000. That is not 4,000. Those inflated numbers appear in the title and in some popular retellings, but they do not match the primary sources. The truth is, Alexander moves with a small, fast strike force. Before the march, the army gathers at the St. Sophia Cathedral in Novgorod. Archbishop Spiridon blesses the troops. Alexander addresses his men. The life of Alexander records his words. There are not many of us here. The enemy is strong, but God is not with force. He is with truth. So follow your prince. Short, direct, no grand speeches, just the facts. We are outnumbered. We trust God. Let us go. The Novgorodian force moves down the Volkhov River to Lake Ladoga. At Ladoga, they pick up reinforcements. Then they move west along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and turn south down the Izhora River. They approach the Swedish camp from the land side. The Swedes are camped at the river mouth. They have set tents and marquees. The life says they were confident. They expected Novgorod to need time to gather forces. They expected advance warning. They were wrong. July 15th. 1240. Sunday. The Novgorod First Chronicle specifies the date in the memory of Kirik and Ulita. The same day the 630 Holy Fathers held a meeting in Chalcedon. The chronicler is referencing the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon in 451, which actually occurred in October, not July, but medieval chroniclers sometimes conflate feast days. What matters is the precision, 15th of July. That specificity suggests the account comes from someone who was there or who spoke to witnesses. Alexander attacks in daylight. Some modern retellings say he struck under cover of darkness, but the Novgorod First Chronicle does not specify a night attack. The element is surprise. The Swedes are resting. They have not fortified. Alexander hits them hard. The battle lasts several hours. The chronicle says there was a great gathering of the Swedes, and their leader, called Spiridon, was killed there. Some claimed even the bishop was slain. A great number of them fell. The fighting is brutal. The Novgorodians cut through the camp. The life of Alexander, written 40 years later, describes 6 heroic deeds by named warriors. Gavrilo Oleksich rides onto a Swedish ship and fights. Spislav Yakunovich charges with only an axe. Yakov Polochianin attacks with a sword. Misha fights on foot. Sava cuts down a tent with a Swedish commander inside. Ratmir fights until he is overwhelmed and dies. These details come from hagiography, not battlefield reports, so historians treat them cautiously. But they reflect the chaotic close combat that medieval river ambushes produce. The Swedish losses pile up. The Novgorod First Chronicle says, when they had loaded 2 ships with the bodies of high-born men, they let them sail to the sea. But the others that were unnumbered they cast to a pit that they buried. 2 ships worth of nobles. That is 40 to 80 bodies, if each ship holds 20 to 40 men and you pack them tight. The chronicle says unnumbered common soldiers were buried in a mass grave, a pit at the battle site. Many others were wounded. The Swedes break, they abandon camp, they board their ships. The chronicle says that same night they fled without waiting for the Monday light with shame. They retreat overnight. They do not wait for dawn. That is panic. Novgorodian casualties. The chronicle lists 4 named deaths: Konstantin Lugotinich, Guryata Pinyashchinich, Namest, Drocilo Nezdylov, son of the tanner. Then it says, but including the people of Ladoga, 20 men or less, God knows. 20 casualties total. That number strains belief. Medieval chroniclers often minimize friendly losses and inflate enemy dead. 20 killed in several hours of close quarters fighting against several hundred Swedes. Historians debate this. Some suggest the chronicle only counts nobles and Druzhina warriors, not militia. Others argue the battle was over so quickly that most Novgorodians never engaged. If Alexander hit the Swedish camp while they were unprepared, if panic spread fast, if the Swedes ran for the ships within an hour or two, then light Novgorodian losses make sense. The Swedes lost their commander, they lost their bishops, or at least claimed to. They lost cohesion, they fled. The Swedish fleet disappears down the Neva and out into the Gulf of Finland. The Novgorod First Chronicle says Prince Alexander came back home with Novgorodians and people of Ladoga, all well protected by God and Saint Sophia and all the prayers of the holy men. The victory is complete. Novgorod is safe. The fur trade routes remain open. Lake Ladoga stays under Novgorodian control. The Gulf of Finland does not become a Swedish lake. The Swedes do not return to the Neva for 16 years. Their next expedition comes in 1256, after Birger Jarl consolidates Sweden and after the Folkung Civil War ends. But Alexander gains something more valuable than a military win. He gains a name. In the 15th century, Russian chroniclers start calling him Alexander Nevsky, Alexander of the Neva. The battle makes him. Before this, he is just another young prince. After this, he is the man who saved Novgorod when the south was burning. That reputation carries him through the next crisis. In 1242, 2 years later, Alexander fights the battle on the ice at Lake Peipus against the Teutonic Knights. He wins that too. His legend grows. The Russian Orthodox Church canonizes him as a saint in 1547. Peter the Great moves his relics to St. Petersburg in 1723, 2 years after signing the Treaty of Nystad that ends the Great Northern War against Sweden. Peter deliberately makes Alexander the patron saint of his new capital, built on the Neva, the same river where Alexander fought Swedes 5 centuries earlier. The symbolism is obvious. Peter defeats Sweden. Alexander defeated Sweden. St. Petersburg is built on Nevsky's ground. Now, let us talk about what historians argue. The battle itself is only mentioned in Russian sources. No Swedish chronicle from the 13th or 14th century references a defeat on the Neva in 1240. That absence raises questions. Some scholars suggest the battle was smaller than Russian sources claim, just a skirmish between a raiding party and a Novgorodian patrol. Others point out that Sweden was in civil war, and defeated expeditions led by out-of-favor nobles would not make it into royal chronicles. Norwegian sources are also silent, even though Norwegians allegedly participated. Finnish and Tavastian involvement is mentioned in the Novgorod First Chronicle, but those tribes left no written records. The scale debate centers on whether this was a major invasion or a raid. Scholar Janet Martin from the University of Miami, writing in 2007, argues the Swedish attack was one episode in a long series of hostile encounters between Novgorod and Sweden over control of Finnic tribes and access to the Gulf of Finland. Not a full-scale campaign aimed at conquering Novgorod. Historian John Lister Illingworth Fennell from Oxford states there's no evidence of any coordinated Swedish plan to invade Novgorod in 1240. Soviet-era historian Igor Pavlovich Shaskolsky, writing in the 1950s, argued the opposite, citing the Life of Alexander, which says the Swedes intended to conquer Novgorod. Modern consensus leans toward the smaller interpretation, a raiding force of several hundred fighters, not an invasion army of thousands. Why does the number matter? Because the battle gets mythologized. Russian nationalist histories from the 19th and 20th centuries inflate it into a civilization-saving event. The title of this documentary uses numbers like 4,000 Novgorodians and 10,000 Swedes. Those figures do not appear in any primary source. They come from later patriotic retellings that exaggerate for dramatic effect. The Novgorod First Chronicle, our earliest source, gives no total troop counts. It says Swedes came in great strength with many ships. It says Alexander had Novgorodians and people of Ladoga. Later hagiographies, written centuries after the fact, expand details and add heroic flourishes. By the time Soviet historians get involved, The battle is framed as a defense against Western Catholic imperialism, part of the ideological conflict between Orthodox Russia and the capitalist West. That framing persists. The truth sits in the middle. The battle happened. Alexander won. The Swedes fled. Novgorod stayed independent. Those facts are solid. The scale was smaller than myth suggests. A few hundred Swedes, 1,000 to 1,500 Novgorodians, several hours of fighting, 20 to perhaps 50 Novgorodian dead. 80 to 150 Swedish dead based on 2 ships of nobles, plus an unknown number of common soldiers buried in a pit. Not thousands, not tens of thousands. A sharp, fast raid that Alexander intercepted and crushed before it could develop into something bigger. Archaeological evidence is thin. In the early 2000s, historian Petr Sorokin from St. Petersburg State University found a single 13th century arrowhead near the church at Izhora. That is the only confirmed artifact directly linked to the battle. No mass graves have been excavated, no weapon caches, no fortification traces. The river mouth has changed over 8 centuries. Modern industrial development around St. Petersburg has destroyed much of the original landscape. The exact battle site within the 300 by 300 meter area at the Izhora mouth is unknown. 4 monuments and a museum mark the general location, but the precise ground where men died in 1240 is lost. Here is what we know about the strategic context. Novgorod in 1240 controls a vast trading network. Furs from the northern forests flow through Novgorod to the Hanseatic League. German merchants from Lübeck and Bremen maintain a trading post in Novgorod. The city is rich. It sits at the southern end of the Varangian trade route that once connected Scandinavia to Byzantium via the Volga and Dnieper rivers. By 1240, that southern route is cut by Mongol control. The western route through the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic becomes even more critical. Whoever controls Lake Ladoga and the Neva River mouth controls access to Novgorod. Sweden wants that control for 2 reasons: economic and religious. Economically, breaking Novgorod's fur monopoly would redirect wealth to Stockholm. Religiously, the Catholic Church sees Orthodox Novgorod as schismatic. The Mongol invasion weakens Novgorod. Kiev falls. Southern principalities submit to Batu Khan. Novgorod escapes Mongol conquest not by fighting, but by preemptively offering tribute. Alexander's father Yaroslav negotiates with the Golden Horde. Novgorod becomes a tributary but keeps its autonomy. That deal happens in 1238, 2 years before the Neva battle. So when Swedes arrive in 1240, Novgorod is already paying tribute to Mongols. The city cannot afford a 2-front war. If Swedes take Lake Ladoga, Novgorod is strangled. That is why Alexander moves so fast. He cannot let the Swedes establish a fortified base. The life of Alexander says the Swedes were setting up camp and starting fortification work. If they dig in, if they build a palisade, if they bring in more troops, Novgorod has a siege on its hands. Alexander avoids that by hitting them before they finish. Speed wins. Surprise wins. The Swedes expect days or weeks before Novgorod responds. Alexander gives them hours. The aftermath is immediate and political. Alexander returns to Novgorod. The boyars, the noble class, are unhappy. The Novgorod First Chronicle says Alexander quarreled with the Novgorodians and withdrew to Pereyaslav-Zaleski less than a year after the victory. The reasons are murky. Some historians suggest the boyars resented his growing power. Others think disputes over taxation or military command drove the split. Medieval Russian city-states operated as quasi-republics. The Vesh, the city assembly, held real power. Princes served at the pleasure of the city. If the boyars decided they did not need Alexander, they could dismiss him. That appears to be what happened. But then the Teutonic Knights attack. In September 1240, the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Order captures Izborsk, a fortress south of Novgorod. By autumn, they take Pskov. German crusaders are now within striking distance of Novgorod. The city panics. The boyars beg Alexander to return. He does. He arrives in 1241. He retakes Pskov. He pushes the Germans back. On April 5th, 1242, he meets the main Teutonic force on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, called Lake Chud in Russian. The battle is remembered as the Battle on the Ice. Alexander wins again. The Teutonic Knights retreat. Novgorod signs a peace treaty with the order in 1243. That victory, combined with the Neva win, cements Alexander's reputation. But there is a darker side. After 1242, Alexander becomes increasingly close to the Mongols. In 1246, his father Yaroslav dies under suspicious circumstances after being summoned to the Mongol capital at Karakorum. Yaroslav may have been poisoned. Alexander travels to the Golden Horde in 1249 and receives the title of Grand Prince of Kiev and all Rus from Batu Khan. His younger brother Andrei receives Vladimir. In 1252, Alexander visits the Horde again. This time he helps the Mongols suppress his own brother. Andrei rebels against Mongol tribute demands. Batu Khan sends a punitive expedition. Alexander does not defend Andrei. The Tatars drive Andrei out. Alexander becomes Grand Prince of Vladimir, the most powerful position in northern Rus. From 1252 until his death in 1263, Alexander serves the Golden Horde faithfully. He collects tribute from other Russian cities. He enforces Mongol tax policy. In 1259, he leads an army to Novgorod and forces the city to pay tribute it had refused. The Novgorod First Chronicle records that Alexander rode through the streets with Mongol officials, writing down Christian houses for census and taxation. The people resisted. Alexander brought Tatar troops to enforce compliance. Historian John Fennell writes, the Tatar yoke began not so much during the invasion of Batu into Russia, but from the moment Alexander Nevsky betrayed his brothers. That is a harsh judgment, but it reflects reality. Alexander chose collaboration. Some historians defend his choice. The Mongols were unbeatable. Resisting meant annihilation. By submitting, Alexander preserved the Orthodox Church and Russian cultural identity. Western crusaders wanted religious conversion. The Mongols only wanted tribute. They let Russians keep their faith. Alexander saw the Mongols as the lesser threat. Historian Orlando Figes writes, Nevsky's collaboration was no doubt motivated by his distrust of the West, which he regarded as a greater threat to Orthodox Russia than the Golden Horde. That calculation shaped Russian foreign policy for centuries: align with the East against the West, accept Mongol overlordship to avoid Catholic domination. Whether that was pragmatic or cowardly depends on perspective. Alexander Nevsky dies on November 14th, 1263 Thors. Returning from his fourth trip to the Golden Horde, he falls ill in Sarai, the Mongol capital on the lower Volga. He makes it back to Gorodets on the Volga, where he dies. Some historians suspect poison, others say natural illness. His body is buried in the Nativity Monastery in Vladimir. In 1547, Metropolitan Macarius canonizes him. In 1723, Peter the Great moves his relics to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg. The Russian Orthodox Church celebrates his feast day on November 23rd in the old calendar. August 30th in the new, the Soviet Union revived his image during World War II. In 1938, Sergei Eisenstein directed a propaganda film, Alexander Nevsky, with a famous score by Sergei Prokofiev. The movie shows German knights drowning under ice at Lake Pepos. A scene historians say is fictional. Stalin approved the film as anti-German propaganda. When the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the film was pulled. When Germany invaded in 1941, it was re-released. Alexander became a symbol of resistance. The Neva battle sits at the center of this mythology. Without the Neva win, Alexander does not get the name Nevsky. Without the name, his later victories are less iconic. The battle on July 15th, 1240 Thos, is the origin point of a legend. But legends distort. The battle was smaller than myth claims. The casualties were lower, the strategic impact was limited. Sweden did not attempt another major push into Novgorod territory for decades, but that may reflect Sweden's internal chaos more than fear of Alexander. By the time Birger Jarl consolidates power and leads an expedition in 1256, Alexander defeats him again in Finland. Birger retreats. Sweden turns its attention to securing control over Finland before pushing east. So what actually happened at the Neva? Strip away the hagiography. Strip away the patriotic inflation. Strip away the Soviet propaganda. Here is the skeleton. A young prince leading 1,000 to 1,500 fighters ambushed a smaller Swedish raiding party at a river mouth. The Swedes numbered a few hundred. They were setting up camp. They were unprepared. Alexander hit them fast. The Swedes lost their commander. They panicked. They fled overnight. Novgorodian losses were light, possibly as few as 20 dead. Swedish losses were higher. Perhaps 100 to 150, including nobles whose bodies filled 2 ships. The rest were buried in a pit. The battle lasted a few hours. It secured Novgorod's access to the Baltic. It gave Alexander a reputation. That reputation carried political weight. It let him negotiate with the Golden Horde from a position of strength. It let him dominate northern Rus for 20 years. Did 4,000 Novgorodians destroy 10,000 Swedes? No, those numbers are fantasy. Did Novgorod win a significant tactical victory that shaped regional power dynamics for decades? Yes. The truth is less dramatic than the myth, but more interesting. A small, fast strike executed with precision against an overconfident opponent. Classic ambush tactics. Alexander read the strategic situation correctly. He moved faster than the enemy expected. He hit them before they could dig in. He shattered their morale. That is how battles are won. Not with speeches about God and truth, not with miraculous interventions, with speed and surprise and violence. The Novgorod First Chronicle ends its account with a simple line. Prince Alexander came back home with Novgorodians and people of Ladoga, all well protected by God. That is the chronicler's perspective. God protected them. Modern historians see human factors: intelligence from Pelgacy, speed from Alexander, discipline from the Druzina, panic among the Swedes, weather conditions that maybe favored the Novgorodians, river geography that bottlenecked the Swedish escape. All of those combined to produce a decisive win. And what about the arrowhead found at Izhora? Peter Sorokin's discovery in the early 2000s is the only physical proof. A single iron arrowhead dated to the 13th century by metallurgical analysis, found near the northwestern corner of the Alexander Nevsky church. That church was built in the 18th century on the supposed battle site. The arrowhead matches the period. It could have come from the battle. It could have come from hunting. It could have come from another skirmish. One arrowhead does not prove thousands died. It proves people used weapons there in the 13th century. That is all. The mass grave mentioned in the chronicle has never been found. The two ships loaded with Swedish nobles are long gone. The Swedish source, silence means we cannot cross-check the Russian account. We have one side of the story. That side says they won, they list their dead by name, they say the enemy fled in shame. Those are the facts we have. Historians work with incomplete evidence. The Neva battle is a case study in how myths grow from sparse records. A few paragraphs in a medieval chronicle become a national founding myth. A young prince becomes a saint. A river skirmish becomes a civilization-saving battle. But here is what remains undeniable. On July 15th, 1240 E, at the mouth of the Izhora River, Novgorodian forces under Alexander Yaroslavich engaged Swedish-led crusaders and won. The Swedes withdrew. Novgorod maintained control of the trade routes. Alexander earned the name Nevsky. 2 years later, he fought the Teutonic Knights and won again. Those victories shaped the political landscape of northern Rus. They positioned Novgorod to survive the Mongol period with some autonomy intact. They gave Alexander the leverage to become the dominant prince of Vladimir and architect of early Russian collaboration with the Golden Horde. If you measure the battle only by body count and troop numbers, it is small. If you measure it by political consequences, it is large. Medieval battles often worked that way. The scale of fighting mattered less than the perception of victory. Alexander won at the Neva. That perception let him dictate terms. It let him control Novgorod politics. It let him negotiate with Mongols and Germans and Swedes from a position of strength. A 19-year-old prince with a small druzhina and 1,000 volunteers defeated a crusader expedition backed by papal authority. That story spreads. It builds reputation. Reputation is power. Let us address the title directly. 4,000 Novgorodian warriors destroyed 10,000 Swedes. Those numbers do not match the evidence. The Novgorod First Chronicle, our most reliable source, gives no total counts. The Life of Alexander, written 40 years later by monks, focuses on heroic deeds, not statistics. Later chronicles from the 15th and 16th centuries expand the story, but they are hagiography, not journalism. Modern historians estimate 1,000 to 1,500 Novgorodians and a few hundred Swedes. The title inflates both sides by a factor of 3 to 5. Why? Because larger numbers sound more dramatic. Because viral history demands big claims. Because audiences want epic battles, not tactical skirmishes. But accuracy matters. Exaggeration undermines trust. When you claim 10,000 Swedes died and the evidence shows maybe 150, you lose credibility. The real story is impressive enough. A young commander moves with incredible speed. He covers 70 kilometers from Novgorod to Izhora in time to catch the Swedes before they fortify. He launches a surprise attack in daylight. He breaks their morale. He drives them off. He loses only 20 men or so. That is excellent battlefield performance. It does not need inflation. So here is the corrected version. 1,200 to 1,500 Novgorodian warriors destroyed or routed several hundred Swedish crusaders at the Neva River in 1240 hours, suffering minimal casualties and securing regional dominance for decades. Less catchy. More accurate. History is not marketing. We do not get to round up for effect. What would the battle have looked like on the ground? The Izhora River is small. At its mouth, it is maybe 30 to 50 meters wide. The Neva is broader, 200 to 600 meters, depending on location. The Swedish ships would be beached or anchored in the Neva just past the Izhora confluence. The camp sprawls along the south bank. Tents for troops, larger pavilions for commanders and bishops, supply crates, horse lines, fires. The Swedes feel safe. They are on ships. They can retreat to water if needed. They have crusade banners. They have priests blessing them. They have fought pagan Finns and won. Novgorod is Orthodox Christian, but from a Catholic perspective that is almost as bad as pagan. The Pope authorized this. God must be with them. Then Novgorodian cavalry appears on the southern approach. Drugina warriors in mail and helmets. Boyar cavalry. Militia foot soldiers with spears and axes. They come fast. The Swedes scramble. Some grab weapons. Some run for the ships. The Novgorodians crash into the camp. Close quarters. Axes. Swords. Spears. Shields. Men shouting. Horses screaming. The Swedish commander, Spiridon, goes down early. That breaks cohesion. Troops look for leadership. There is none. Panic spreads. Men run. The Novgorodians push toward the ships. Some Swedes make it aboard. Others are cut down at the water's edge. Bodies fall into the Izhora. Blood stains the riverbank. The fighting lasts 2 hours, maybe 3. By afternoon it is over. The Swedes load their dead nobles into 2 ships and sail out. The rest of the dead they dump in a pit. That night they flee completely. Alexander stands on the bank, watching sails disappear into the Gulf of Finland. That is the battle. Raw, brutal, over quickly. Medieval combat was not a chess game. It was chaos. Whoever kept discipline won. The Novgorodians kept discipline. The Swedes did not. Alexander recognized that the key to victory was speed. Do not give them time to prepare. Do not give them time to fortify. Hit them now. That decision won the battle. Everything else followed from that. Now, zoom out. What was happening elsewhere in 1240? Kiev burns in December. The Mongols are unstoppable. Badukhan's forces destroyed Ryazan in 1237. They took Vladimir in 1238. They burned Kozelsk after a 7-week siege that killed 4,000 Mongols. The boy prince of Kozelsk, Vasily, and his people resisted until the city was erased. The Mongols called it the evil city and left no survivors. That is what Mongol conquest looked like. Total. By 1240, they control everything south of Novgorod and east of Poland. Novgorod survives only by submitting early. At the same time, the Teutonic Knights are expanding east. They took Estonia from Denmark in 1237. They control Livonia. They're pushing into Votia and Pskov. The Catholic crusading movement sees the Baltic as a mission field. Pagans need to be converted or eliminated. Orthodox Christians are schismatics who need to be brought back to Rome. The Mongol chaos gives crusaders an opportunity. Russia is weak. Strike now. That is the calculation. Novgorod sits in the middle. Mongols to the south and east. Germans to the west. Swedes to the northwest. The city has always been rich, but now it is isolated. The old trade routes are cut. The Varangian route through Kiev to Constantinople is gone. The Baltic route is contested. Novgorod needs to fight on multiple fronts. Alexander provides that fighting. He wins at the Neva in 1240. He wins at Lake Peipus in 1242. Those wins buy time. They keep Novgorod independent for another 2 centuries until Ivan III annexes it in 1478. But the cost is submission to the Mongols. That is the deal Alexander makes. Fight the West. Submit to the East. Preserve orthodoxy. Pay tribute. That strategy works for Alexander. It works for Novgorod. It works for the Orthodox Church. It does not work for the people paying taxes. It does not work for Alexander's brother Andrei, who refuses to collaborate and gets crushed. History remembers Alexander as a hero. Some contemporaries saw him as a collaborator. Both views are true. Let us return to the original question. How did Novgorodian warriors destroy Swedish crusaders at the Neva? The answer is speed, surprise, and decisive violence. Alexander moved faster than the Swedes expected. He attacked before they were ready. He killed their commander early. He broke their morale. He drove them off. The numbers were smaller than myth claims, but the tactical execution was excellent. That is the truth. A well-executed ambush by a competent young commander against an overconfident crusader force. Not a miracle. Not divine intervention. Human skill and human violence. Here is a final piece of evidence that reframes everything. In 1958, a stone monument was erected on the right bank of the Izhora River, about 200 to 300 meters from the mouth. The inscription reads, "On July 15, 1240, the battle occurred here, in which the Russian army under the command of Alexander Nevsky thoroughly and convincingly defeated the numerically superior enemy forces which had invaded our motherland." Erected by the city military community to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Leningrad, that monument was placed in the 1950s during the Cold War. The language is telling. Numerically superior enemy forces invaded our motherland. This is Soviet framing. The battle becomes a defense against Western aggression. Alexander becomes a proto-Soviet hero resisting imperialism. That interpretation served Stalin's propaganda needs. It shaped how generations of Russians learned about the battle. It embedded inflated casualty numbers into public consciousness. The myth overgrew the history. But the archaeology tells a different story. 1 arrowhead, no mass graves, no fortification remains, no weapon caches. The battle happened, but it was smaller and faster than the myth suggests. The real achievement was not killing 10,000 enemies. It was reading the strategic situation correctly and acting decisively. Alexander understood that Novgorod could not afford a prolonged siege. He understood that Crusader forces dig in fast. He understood that waiting meant losing. So he moved. That decision, made in a matter of hours after receiving Pelgasy's message, shaped northern Russian history for decades. Speed won. The rest is commentary.